Percy Markham was passionate by nature. He was one of Australia's foremost collectors of veteran and vintage cars. He amassed a world-class collection of rare vehicles. He regularly attended auctions to collect those small bits and pieces to finish the restoration of his vehicles. His interest in motorised transport began from an early age when he worked in motor garages. As a young man, he became quite familiar with vintage and veteran cars and their general functioning. He had good general knowledge of the mechanics of vehicles and was comfortable restoring them. Percy and his wife Marjorie had 4 children, a daughter, June, and 3 sons, John, Roger, and Barry. Markham's collection grew, and, as his son John remembered, then it started. So then he said, well, where are we going to put them? So he bought a little commercial building in Lake Henderson, and then he really got the bug, and he'd slip overseas to oversee car auctions and things like that. And then he started to get some really quality vehicles, and it kept on growing and growing. He became more famous and famous. And so Percy Markham established his own auto museum. Percy Markham had his own museum, the Antique Auto Museum in Perth. This museum was located at 76 Flynn Street in Wembley. The museum opened to the public in 1965, and the collection included 32 motor vehicles, 5 motorcycles, and a horse-drawn carriage. John remembered. Like us kids, we had to do our duty and help, service them and help conduct afternoon tours. We'd be cleaning rust and things like that. Very much a family restoration project, which we enjoyed. This museum was of such high standard, being the only museum in Australia mentioned in the publication, The World's Motor Museums. The Popular Mechanics, published by the Hearst magazines in 1970, also mentioned the Markham collection and described one of his cars, the 1913 Nazaro, as the only of its kind in the world. The Nicholson's book, when referring to the Markham's car collection, said, "This collection, one of the finest in the Southern Hemisphere, contains vehicles ranging from an 1843 horse-drawn Landau and a number of motorcycles dating from 1904 to around 40 cars. The latter embrace such rarities as an 1898 Star, 1906 Germain, and a 1909 Minerva from Belgium, a 1910 BSA, a Nazaro of 1913, one of the great Model 48 locomobiles, this one of 1914, a 1921 Stanley Steamer, and a 1923 Itala." In 1967, Markham wrote to the Honourable David Brand, Premier of Western Australia, and Sir Thomas Mere, Chairman of Trustees of the WA Museum Board, proposing the government take over his antique car museum to preserve the car collection. David Ryde, then the director of the WA Museum, sought advice of Jack Willis, director of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney. Norman Harwood of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney said that the cars were a collection unequalled in Australia and which would bear comparison with the most technological museums overseas. He gave his opinion that such chance to acquire a collection might never come again. He also mentioned that WA Museum had got the collection at a bargain price, and the Markham cars could be worth double its present value in the next 10 to 15 years. The acquisition of these fine cars would play a valuable part in stimulating interest in technological history in WA and would become an important tourist attraction. The collection illustrates the development of the motor car. The educational value of the collection is far-reaching. It is the first comprehensive collection of veteran and vintage cars to be exhibited in a state museum. In November 1969, the Premier Sir David Brand approved the acquisition of the car collection and highlighted, "The collection should be preserved for the state rather than broken up and dispersed." 22 beautifully restored cars of the Markham Car Collection were sold, and in addition, 5 motorcycles and a double-decker bus were gifted to the WA Museum. Percy Markham stated, "My own long-standing ambition is to see my collection state-owned, to be preserved for all time for Western Australia. With this in mind, I ask you to give serious consideration to state ownership. Rest assured, I will make my own substantial contribution." The agreement between the WA Museum and Percy Markham was signed on the 23rd of December 1969. The total amount of sale price was 180,000 Australian dollars, from which a payment of 30,000 was paid immediately to Markham. After that, the museum paid $15,000 each year over a 10-year period without any interest. The final payment was made in November of 1979. Meanwhile, the Markham family donated $100,000 in 2 instalments to the museum to be used for extensions to the museum buildings. John remembered, "The main thing was that when he left this earth, he would be content to know that the Percy Markham Car Collection was his, like a benefactor for the state heritage. And then he thought, well, how can I do this? And so then the finance was a secondary. That gave him some security, but he really wanted to leave a legacy. That's the emphasis." In 1971, David Hutchinson, curator of the WA Museum, let the Markham family know that the cars will be on display by about November. "19 years later, in the late 1980s, John Bannister, then the director of the WA Museum, wrote to Percy Markham, advising him that the museum was considering selling 10 of the 22 acquired cars. In 1988, the museum's option was, the deal with Mr. Markham in 1969 was a straight-out commercial purchase of a collection of 22 cars. The museum suggested that the collection had no significance to Western Australia. The cars did not fit their collection policy. It was also suggested that the decision to sell the cars was in response to the pressure from the government to reduce the number of items held by the museum. David Parker, the Minister for Arts, confirmed his approval to split the cars in the Markham collection and is reported to have approved that 10 of the cars be individually auctioned. Percy Markham was disappointed. He replied, "I wanted to leave something permanent for the people to enjoy, and I hope that it will stay that way." John Markham later noted, "That's what he wanted, was to be a legacy for the state. Once a collection is broken up, they never again can be reaccumulated." In 1989, the Veteran Car Club of Western Australia declared the collection a valuable heritage collection and the property of the people of Western Australia. It was pointed out the Markham family had virtually donated the collection and many motoring enthusiasts saw the transaction as a philanthropic citizen who had made a valuable collection available to the museum, some vehicles as a donation and others at almost donation status. The Veteran Car Club argued the museum was hiding behind an illogical collection policy to auction cars at a time when the government had not recovered from recent disastrous financial losses and was looking for any means to find extra funds. Motoring communities throughout Western Australia believed the cars should stay in Western Australia. In 1989, more than 100 vintage cars drove up St George's Terrace to Parliament House, honking their horns in protest against the sale. On the 14th of February 1990, a final appeal was written by Joseph Martin to the Minister for Arts. This collection, owned by the WA Museum, is part of Western Australian heritage. To lose such a collection is an injustice to the people of WA. Finally, despite all the protests, the government decided to sell the cars. The museum elected to sell 10 highly significant vintage and luxury cars, the cream of the collection. The museum believed these cars had no real association with Western Australia's culture or history, and as such, were not native to WA. They said these vehicles have no historical significance to Western Australia. In 1990, 10 of the 22 treasures from the Markham collection were auctioned. The auction was held on the 17th of February 1990 by the Christie's Auction House in the Burswood Casino in Victoria Park. The 10 cars advertised were the 1909 Cesare Nordine, 1937 Rolls-Royce Phantom 3 Touring Limousine, 1933 Rolls-Royce Phantom 3 Continental, 1928 Bentley Sports Tourer, 1913 Delage Tourer, 1911 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost Landaulette, 1911 Peugeot Tourer, 1909 Renault Limousine, 1909 Minerva Tourer, 1898 Star Vis-a-Vis. John Markham remembered. The other thing is, it's interesting that one car that was sold at the auction sold for more than what they paid for the whole collection, and those cars went overseas. The cars went to 3 buyers from WA, 2 from Victoria, 1 each from South Australia and New South Wales, and 2 from the United Kingdom. 1 car remained unsold, the 1898 Star Vis-a-Vis. Its auction sale was disputed. It was ultimately returned and is now on display at the Whiteman Park Museum in WA. Let's summarise the facts in chronological order. 1969. Percy Markham sold 22 veteran and vintage cars to the WA Museum. Price, 180,000 Australian dollars. Percy Markham gifted 5 motorcycles and a double-decker bus to the WA Museum. Value, 1,250 Australian dollars. The museum paid Percy Markham an initial payment of 30,000 Australian dollars and then 150,000 Australian dollars in 10 equal annual instalments of 15,000 Australian dollars interest-free. 1971. Percy Markham donated $100,000 to the West Australian Museum. 1979. The West Australian Museum paid the last instalment of 15,000 Australian dollars to Percy Markham. 1988. The WA Museum decided to sell 10 cars from the Markham collection. 1989. Individuals, politicians and motoring communities wrote petitions and held protests against the sale. Percy Markham and the motoring communities were disappointed, losing all confidence in the WA Museum. 1990. The WA Museum auctioned the 10 cars, 9 were sold and 1 escaped. 2004. The WA Museum's trustee established the Percy W. Markham Fund. 2014. The WA Museum has not provided a list of the items purchased since the car auction, and of the collections acquired using the Percy W. Markham Fund, except for the purchase of a Fowler traction engine in 1990. The Markham family only knows that the money was used to shift the museum's premises from the Francis Street to its current location in Welshpool.